We are joined by our friend and reoccurring guest on the Just Baseball show, Paul Hembekides of ESPN and Buster Olney's partner in crime on the Baseball Tonight podcast to talk about the recent Hall of Fame vote. And because we love Hembo so much, we have coined these segments Hembo's History Corner. And I can't wait to break down the recent Hall of Fame vote with you, Hembo. Thanks so much for coming on. You ready to talk some ball?
Dude, there's nothing I enjoy doing more than talking ball with you, and there's nothing that I enjoy more than the Baseball Hall of Fame. If I had my druthers, I'd have gotten married in Cooperstown, New York. My wife had other ideas for some inexplicable reason, but we'll table those for another time, of course.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Cooperstown wedding is going to be in the cards for me, even though that would be awesome. So I think it's important to describe what this vote is because, I think a lot of people are used to the normal BBWAA vote, but this is a little bit different. The Contemporary Hall of Fame is not a separate Contemporary Hall of Fame, but it's rather a voting mechanism within the National Baseball Hall of Fame instead of just the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot. It includes those who didn't get enough writer votes, and they're focusing on players after the year 1980. And the committee, it's comprised of 16 members, 7 former players, 4 executives, 2 owners, 2 baseball writers, and a historian. And you need 12 of 16 votes to get in. And if you get fewer than 5 votes, you would not be eligible to get in the next time they vote every 3 years. So on the committee, and you correct me if I'm wrong, outside of the obvious production on the field, they're supposed to consider integrity, sportsmanship, and character. What else did I miss?
Not a whole lot, to be honest with you. The last thing, or the second to last thing, rather, that you said is the most important one, because while we can congratulate Jeff Kent until we're blue in the face, and we will, he is a wholly deserving candidate to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. As you might expect or imagine, the biggest takeaways from a national audience here are Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens both receiving fewer than 5 votes on this 16-person committee, which is to say they're ineligible to be voted on next time in 2028, which means that in 2031, Bonds and Clemens, and I suppose Gary Sheffield and any number of other people who received fewer than 5 this time around will have one more bite at the apple. And what you did neglect to mention is that if they don't get at least 5 votes that time around, their candidacy expires, which is to say 6 years from now, there's a non-zero chance, perhaps even a meaningful chance, that both Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens will be excluded from the Baseball Hall of Fame for good.
So I want to talk about Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, and I think that's kind of the main title that everybody uses when talking about this current Hall of Fame vote. But Tim Kurkjian on his YouTube show, which I highly recommend everybody checking out, it's Tim Kurkjian and his son, and they talk baseball. I think it's a great show. You can find it on YouTube. He made a really good point that while Bonds and Clemens are the big story, we're doing a disservice to Jeff Kent by not leading with him. He is the one that got enough votes to get into the Hall of Fame. So I want to start with him. And I think a simple question we can start with is, did Jeff Kent deserve to get into the Hall of Fame?
He did. Jeff Kent, I want to make clear, would not have gotten my vote on the writers' ballot. I don't have a vote. If I had hypothetically had one, I would have been in the at least 53% of those that did not vote Jeff Kent into the Baseball Hall of Fame during the time in which he was eligible. He topped out at 47%, hung out in the teens for most of his candidacy, which is to say he is not a candidate that was terribly palatable to the writers. But I do understand that there is a good faith argument to be made that he belongs in the Hall of Fame for a few obvious reasons. The first of which is there isn't a second baseman that has ever played the game of baseball that hit more home runs than he did. 377 in all, 351 of which came at second base. And as a second baseman, to have produced as many 100 RBI seasons as he did, these are things that voters didn't so much care about, but that the committee did. And you mentioned the demographics of the committee. Most of those players that you mentioned, that you rolled through, are old school players. These are players of yesteryear that I'm not surprised were sympathetic to Jeff Kent's candidacies, because most of the stats that drive his case are traditional baseball stats, back of the baseball card. type stats. Those older players, by and large, aren't going to be predisposed to favoring WAR and WRC plus and any other number of more modern metrics that current fans and current analysts do. And so Jeff Kent's candidacy was much more palatable, much more attractive to this demographic of voters. And so I'm not at all surprised that Jeff Kent was the only one that wound up getting through here. I suppose some could have made a good faith argument that others could have gotten closer, but Carlos Delgado was next closest at 9. Again, you needed 12 to get through. So congratulations to Jeff Kent, and a job well done, because even though he would not have been on my ballot, by no means is the Hall of Fame a lesser place for him being included in it. When I visit the Hall of Fame, as I do every single year, I'll read his plaque and I'll enjoy his placement in it. I think the best comp I could make for you, Peter, is that of Scott Rowland. Not someone I would have voted for, but one of the best third basemen, certainly of his era, and someone that I view as a somewhat deserving Baseball Hall of Famer, and by no means would I view the Baseball Hall of Fame lesser for his inclusion in it. While there are some guys that have gotten elected in somewhat recent years that I would most definitely say that about.
Can you dive in a little bit further to the differences between the BBWAA ballot and the contemporary era ballot? Because from what you said, it seems like the contemporary era ballot is more focused on the back of the baseball card, while the other one is diving kind of deeper into WAR. Is that the main difference between these ballot, or are there others?
So we don't know what the conversations that are had inside closed doors, which is what makes this somewhat maddening. We only know that Bonds and Clemens received fewer than 5 votes. We don't know if that's 1 or 4. But let's consider the fact that Fergie Jenkins, Jim Cott, Juan Marichal, Tony Perez, Ozzie Smith, Alan Trammell, and Robin Yount are old school baseball players. And if I were an old school baseball player staring in the face Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, not Hall of Famers, specifically and only because of suspicion, and I think fair suspicion, of performance-enhancing drugs, who am I to sit here and say that these Hall of Fame players aren't standing on firm ground, that they don't want cheaters, or at least alleged cheaters, in the Baseball Hall of Fame? I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that Bonds and Clemens didn't have fair representation in that room. But if you're a member of a fraternity and you did it, quote unquote, the right way, I think the character clause is going to be something that you prioritize, even weaponized. Whereas baseball writers, and if I'm ever fortunate enough to be on a ballot, this is how I would attack filling mine out. I would have to look at everything in totality, right? And for me, and you and I are both numbers crunchers for sure, those are things that would matter a whole heck of a lot more than they might to Tony Perez or Alan Trammell or Robin Yount. And so in a 16-person committee, you've been in rooms with that many people, of course. It's a very different dynamic than hundreds of people individually sending in their ballots via snail mail, which, yes, is still the way that the Baseball Hall of Fame does it. I don't especially love the fact that they have formed all these committees to sort of sneak players through, and I think it's that pernicious, truly, and also block players in the case of steroid guys like Bonds and Clemens. But this is the way the Hall of Fame has decided to do their business, and Jeff Kent was the biggest recipient of that this year.
So outside of Jeff Kent, who are the biggest downstream beneficiaries of this?
So that is an outstanding question, because what Jeff Kent does, really, and I'm dying to know if you agree with me, is open up the door for Chase Utley specifically and other second basemen that haven't had the kind of say in that room that they may have had either traditionally in the past or might even project to have in the future. Because whichever metric you choose to use, Jeff Kent comes in between 54 and 56 WAR, which is obviously the starting point. It's not what comes after the equal sign, but it's most definitely the starting point for a lot of modern voters, and modern voters that are filling out the BBWAA ballot might look at precedent. It's one of the most beautiful things about the Baseball Hall of Fame, in my judgment. This has been around for 90 years, a body that has been around for 90 years, and every decision rhymes with the past one and will inform future ones. Precedent is the most important word in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I think Chase Utley, who is still in his early years on the ballot, is the biggest beneficiary of this, because Chase Utley, who also played second base, who played second base demonstrably better, who ran the bases demonstrably better, and at least for his peak, was a comparable hitter to Jeff Kent, is going to have a tailwind, I really do believe, because of the totality of his game and the fact that we now have a second baseman with 55 WAR in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Lou Whitaker is someone that old school fans have long believed belong in. I agree. The same can be said about Bobby Grich. But if you look at the 5-season peak that Chase Utley had between 2005 and 2009, we're talking about legitimately a top half a dozen or so peak in the history of any player at the second base position. Players like Rogers Hornsby and Nap Lajoie and Charlie Gehringer and Joe Morgan and players of that ilk, Eddie Collins, some of the greatest second basemen that have ever lived. And though Chase Utley didn't have the kind of longevity that those guys or even Jeff Kent did, the precedent that having a 55 WAR second baseman in the Hall of Fame do set, I think will inform future BBWAA decisions that the writers make on their future ballots.
I think you make a really interesting point about Chase Utley, and you said that if you had a vote, you wouldn't have given it to Jeff Kent. Would you give it to Chase Utley?
There's no question about it. I view Chase Utley as being one of the most underrated players of his era. I mean, this is a guy that had a 900 OPS as a second baseman in 5 consecutive seasons. I mean, Rogers Hornsby and Charlie Gehringer are the only second basemen in history to do that. Over a 5-year peak, he led all players in baseball across all positions in defensive runs saved, during which time only Albert Pujols produced more WAR. Alex Rodriguez ranked 3rd. This was a mini Phillies dynasty, at least in the context of the National League East. I mean, 5 consecutive 7 WAR seasons is something that only Chase Utley and Joe Morgan have done among middle infielders since World War II. He is an all-time great, or at least had an all-time great peak. But Chase Utley by no means is the only second baseman, as you well know, that will benefit from this. I think Dustin Pedroia is also somebody who had a shorter career, but a brilliant peak that will benefit from Jeff Kent's candidacy. Because one of the things I love about the Hall of Fame is representation, and era representation more specifically. What I hate is the fact that between Joe Morgan and Jeff Kent, very few second basemen got their bite at the Hall of Fame apple, of which Roberto Alomar and Ryan Sandberg are 2 off the top of my head. But I do believe that positions oftentimes are underrepresented in the Baseball Hall of Fame because you're comparing numbers of a second baseman to a first baseman or a corner outfielder. And as the ball knower that you are, you're smart enough to know that those are not apples to apples comparisons.
They are not. Let's look at the guys that didn't get in. And I want to end with Gary Sheffield, but I think the 2 biggest names that people are going to talk about is Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds. And I think the most interesting part of this contemporary era vote is not only did they not get in, they didn't get the 5 votes necessary to stay on the ballot in 3 years. When you're talking about the character clause and the integrity clause, clearly those voters have made a stand here, have took a stand and said, if you took steroids, you're not getting in. Is it as clear as that?
It is as clear as that. It seems fairly obvious to me, and very likely to you as well, not to put words in your mouth, that Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens had a much better shot at the Baseball Hall of Fame in a democratic process via the writers. Because if the Hall of Fame is comprising committees of 16 people, you best believe that they're going to stack the deck against Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. We don't have to even wonder this. We know this because the late, great Joe Morgan, once upon a time, as you'll recall, penned a public letter effectively saying, we don't want the steroid guys in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And that was their official stance. I mean, that might as well have been state-sponsored news. But unfortunately, you and I know that it just can't be that cut and dry because you just can't exclude an entire generation of greats that were, in some sense, the victim of circumstance. Because Major League Baseball, as you know, went from 1986 to the summer of 2004 without testing for steroids. And you can't possibly sit here and tell me that Barry Bonds, who was a Hall of Famer before he used steroids, and Roger Clemens, who was a Hall of Famer long before he used steroids as well, should be penalized, whereas other guys that are very likely already in the Hall of Fame, in part because they used steroids, and just weren't as good as those guys, have reached the heights in which they've reached. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, the biggest mistake they made, truly, was being too good, was breaking baseball, was hitting 73 home runs in 2001 and winning a Cy Young Award at the age of 40. I mean, these are guys that were mutants, and they were so good relative to their peers at such an advanced age that they almost shot themselves in the foot. You'd been better off having only been 10 or 15% better than you were during your peak than basically breaking baseball. And that's effectively what these guys were. They were so good, they ushered in an entire era of testing and the new joint drug agreement that we got in 2002, of which testing began in 2004. But you can't possibly look at those 18 years as anything other than the wild, wild west. And to assume that we knew who used and did not use is intellectually dishonest. And you know this as well as I do. There are already players in the Hall of Fame that we at least believe use performance-enhancing drugs. And there's no obvious reason to believe that Bonds and Clemens were products of steroids, the way that I believe Sammy Sosa, for example, was, which is why I wouldn't vote Sammy Sosa into the Hall of Fame. All this to say, these are complicated decisions that writers and that voters need to make. I've kind of made my peace with the fact that if you've tested positive or we have clear reason to believe that you did so, use steroids after the testing was in place, then you're out for me. So count me out on Manny and count me out on A-Rod. But Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, best we can tell, started using steroids at the peak of the steroid era. And the biggest mistake that they made was being so much greater than their peers.
I'm starting to come around to that opinion where past a certain year, whether that be 2002 or 2004, because Bud Selig, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, is in the Hall of Fame. And at that time, he was kind of brushing this to the side, right? You know, the big home run chase between McGwire and Sosa, Bonds, Clemens, they really brought baseball back. So we almost had a little bit of a blind eye to that. And then once they started really, really testing and saying, if you do this, you are done. So taking out Alex Rodriguez, Manny Ramirez, those guys, but it's such a difficult gray area for me. I feel like I don't even have a strong opinion on it yet. I'm just trying to learn more about the era and figure out truly what I believe, because in my heart of hearts, if you took steroids, you can't get into the Hall of Fame. That's just, no matter what era, what time period, that's my core belief. But the more I learn about the era, the more I really dive deep into it and realize there are certain guys who, just because they didn't get caught, they're in the Hall of Fame. They did the same thing. And also knowing that Bud Selig was pushing things to the side and almost not looking at it, it just makes it so complicated, which brings us to our last player. Why is Gary Sheffield not in the Hall of Fame? 500 home runs, Hembo. 509 to be exact.
You were spitting bars there, my friend. And Gary Sheffield was not just one of the great hitters of his generation, but of any generation. I mean, you watched him like I watched him. Gary Sheffield was terrifying. A career OPS plus of 140. That is within 1 percentage point on either direction of David Ortiz and Miguel Cabrera and Reggie Jackson. The entire list of players with 500 home runs with fewer strikeouts than he has are Ted Williams and Mel Ott. Those are guys that were before the war or literally during the war. And let's remember how great he was for a number of awesome teams. In 1997, that Marlins championship team, he was their 3-hitter and their 4-hitter, had a 424 on base that season. When he was traded to Atlanta in 2002, he hit third for them. They broke their franchise record for runs scored. They scored 907 runs with him being their best hitter. In 3 years for the Yankees, 04 to 06, also the 3-hole hitter for those teams. And that was the highest scoring team in baseball across those 3 seasons. And as you well know, his connections to performance-enhancing drugs are far more tangential than are Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds. He has said under oath that the only steroids he ever used were the cream in the clear, those famous words that Barry Bonds said once upon a time, and he did so unknowingly. That's before a grand jury. And those are the only connections that Gary Sheffield has to steroids. That's not a guy that was a product of performance-enhancing drugs. In some sense, I think he loses from the fact that there are so many lazy writers, so many lazy commentators that do this steroid guy thing, as if everyone's transgressions are equal and of the same import. It is simply not true. Gary Sheffield is a Hall of Fame player, and his connections to PEDs are so much looser than most of the guys we're excluding from the Hall of Fame because of it.
So you think it's simply these guys think that he's connected to steroids and they're not going to vote him in? Because it's clear if you were connected to steroids, at least on this contemporary era ballot, you're out.
Yeah, I think that's approximately correct, but we'd be foolish to pretend like there's nobody in the Hall of Fame with PED suspicion or even connection. I mean, David Ortiz's positive test was leaked once upon a time, quite famously. He's one of the most beloved figures in the history of baseball and got in right away, which is to say we apply a very uneven line of thinking across the board here. And it's not obvious to me why. I think in some sense, David Ortiz, because he played so much later and had such a wonderful career after this leaked positive test, we don't seem to much care. Whereas Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens were, for lack of a better term, the poster children for the steroid era. So they're paying for the transgressions of an entire generation. And who loses? Well, baseball fans lose. Those who visit the Baseball Hall of Fame and don't have the opportunity to read a plaque in the gallery of the best hitter and the best pitcher that I ever saw with my own two eyes, or anyone that you ever saw with your own two eyes, assuming your two eyes are less than 100 years old. It's dishonest. Now, I do understand, and I think there's a good faith argument to be made that while we can chronicle the careers of the players in the museum, they don't belong to be honored in the plaque gallery, which is a juxtaposition that a lot of writers fail to properly make. But ultimately, Bonds and Clemens just have to be an exception to the PED nature of this conversation because they were so much greater and defining players of their generation.
Hembo, thank you so much for coming on. My last question for you is, outside of Bonds and Clemens and Sheffield, did you feel that there were any other snubs on the ballot? I think, my eyes go straight to Carlos Delgado, but are there others that you thought should have at least gotten more, just maybe even gotten in, or at least more votes in this process?
You ask that question to the average 55-year-old man that live in New York, they're going to tell you that Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy belong to be in the Hall of Fame. There's nothing that 55-year-old men love doing than telling me that Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy were better than their baseball reference page tells me he was.
Is it specifically 55-year-olds, or is there like an age gap, or have you noticed that once you turn 55, you automatically start loving Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy?
It's those that came of age in that generation. Right. And that was, of course, a generation that didn't have access to war of no fault of their own. I only make a snide remark because I have heard so much about how great Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy were, although there's no obvious reason to believe they belong in the Hall of Fame. The best answer to your question in a roundabout way is Fernando Valenzuela. In my judgment, Fernando Valenzuela belongs in the Hall of Fame, not just because of what he did on the mound, but because he was a pioneer. He is as pivotal to Mexican-American baseball as any figure that has ever come along. They regard him as their Jackie Robinson. And the way in which he captured the imagination of this country and that one in the early 1980s, and the dominance that he demonstrated over the better course of a decade, to me, when coupled with his impact, with his global reach, Fernando Valenzuela belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I do believe that there's a component of what you meant to baseball qualitatively that should matter a whole heck of a lot more than it seemed to this 16-member panel.
I love that pitch. Thank you so much again, Hembo, for coming on. Plug anything you need. We really appreciate these Hembo history corners, and we can't wait to continue to do them throughout.
I have written 3 sports history books in conjunction with my longtime radio partner, Mike Greenberg. And I, at the moment, am working on we'll call it very special baseball project that you will hopefully someday soon see online and potentially hear on this very podcast feed.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Hembo, for coming on.
Later, bud.